Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Mid-Career Changes, a webinar presented by the Membership and Professional Development Committee and Workshops Committee of the Rare Books and Manuscripts section of the Association of College and Research Libraries. My name is Diane Diaz-DeFazio, and I am joined by Amy Hildreth Chen, Shanae Yvette Morin, Kim Schwenk, and Dr. Lydia Tang. We are happy to have you all here and honored to be here today. Let's go. I am current member at large to RBMS and co-chair of the Membership and Professional Development Committee. I'm presenting today from historical Wasnaze lands dismantled by the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. I am a woman of Mediterranean and Latin heritage with brown eyes and black hair, wearing a dark blue dress with stars. This is one of 8 webinars being offered in the RBMS Jobs and Hiring Workshop series, including the next and final installment called Under/Over-Qualified, the Question of More Degrees, happening on August 17th. There is still room to register at bit.ly/17AUG RBMS Jobs Hiring, which will be added to the chat now. The overarching goal for this series is to connect individuals in galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and special collections, or GLAMS, with other professionals who can share advice and experiences on different aspects of the job market and hiring practices in a variety of related professions. RBMS membership is not required to participate or to present. So, first, some housekeeping. The hashtag for this series is RBMS Jobs Hiring. The session is being recorded. A link of this video will be sent to everyone who registered. The chat is open and may be saved, but is not being recorded. During this event, we ask that you adhere to the ALA, the American Library Association's Statement of Appropriate Conduct, which can be viewed at ALA.org/conferences events, all one word, /statement_appropriate_conduct. And I'm adding that link to the chat now. We thank you in advance for abiding by these guidelines. If you encounter any issues, please get in touch with me or Alois. You can also share your feedback by email at membership@rbms.info. This program runs for 1 hour total. We received numerous questions in advance of the session, so the questions posed to the panelists are synthesized from those we received. The Q&A function is live and available, so if you have questions as we go through, please add them to the Q&A, and if time permits, I will pose those to the panelists. The webinar offers open captioning, and at the bottom of your screen, there should be an option to enable captions or to turn them off if you prefer. And now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our panelists. Amy Hildreth Chen obtained her PhD in English from Emory University in 2013. She worked in special collections and as a subject liaison at the University of Alabama from 2013 to 2015, and at the University of Iowa from 2015 to 2020. Since 2020, Chen has served as the manager of medical publications, editor/project manager, at JMI Laboratories, a micro and molecular laboratory specializing in antibiotics and antifungals. Chen is the author of Placing Papers, published by University of Massachusetts Press in 2020. Shanae Yvette Morin is Director of Community Engagement at the Digital Public Library of America, where she coordinated the Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection. Previously, she was the university archivist and an assistant professor at the University of West Georgia. Shanae holds a BA in Religion and Philosophy from Bethune-Cookman University, a Master of Divinity from Drew Theological School, and a Master of Library Science from North Carolina Central University. As former director of library services and archivist at Payne Theological Seminary, she curated the Payne Theological Seminary and African Methodist Episcopal Church digital collection. Shanae was the 2019 president of the Society of Georgia Archivists and served on the board of directors of the American Theological Library Association. She is also recognized as a 2021 Library Journal Mover and Shaker as a digital developer. Kim Schwenk received her MLIS from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in 2013 and is a rare book cataloger at the University of California, San Diego Special Collections and Archives Library and an antiquarian bookseller with Lux Mentis Booksellers. She has worked in special collections libraries in various roles since the late 1990s. She has also worked as a co-editor for Printing History, the Journal of the American Printing History Association, and is currently a liaison for the Bibliographical Society of America. She has a subject specialization in North American, Latin American, and European witchcraft history and early printed occult texts. And finally, Dr. Lydia Tang. Dr. Tang is an outreach and engagement coordinator for lyricists. Previously, she held archivist positions at Michigan State University, the Library of Congress, and graduate positions at the University of Illinois, where she received her MLIS and Doctor of Musical Arts degrees. She is the 2020 recipient of the Society of American Archivists Mark A. Green Emerging Leader Award and was recognized in 3 SAA Council resolutions for her work on the task force to revise best practices for accessible archives for people with disabilities, the Archival Workers Emergency Fund, and the Accessibility and Disability section. She has been very active in the archive space user community, leading the Staff Interface Enhancement Working Group, Development Prioritization and Usability Subteams, and chairing the Users Advisory Council. Please join me and show your appreciation in the chat in welcoming our speakers with a virtual round of applause. Okay. And now, without further ado, let's jump right in to question number 1 of 4. We'll take a round robin approach where each panelist can offer some thoughts on each question. The first question is, how do I move from another, parentheses, totally different field into GLAMS, or galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and special collections? Follow-up question, perhaps. What is it like to move among special collections librarianship and so-called adjacent professions? We'll start with Shanae, then Kim, then Lydia, then Amy.
Thank you, Diane. I feel like I'm very adept to answer this question because I came to special collections and librarianship from the field of theology, where I was preparing to care for the souls of people. And in that transition, I became, a caretaker of materials and research needs. For me, I had already had that service-oriented, advocating for the needs of others mentality when I started to pursue the MLIS. So I took that intentionality and thinking about my career trajectory and being really conscious of seeing, as I share with our panelists in our pre-talk, seeing like the vigor and the commitment of preachers that I was in school with, and they were working on their ordination and pursuing opportunities to serve in the local church. I took that energy and I said, okay, I'm not going to be a minister, but I'm going to be a librarian. And if I'm going to, transition to this new field, then at least I can take that energy with me. And I saw a lot of volunteer opportunities while I was in library school. At one point, I was interning at 2 museums, and I had 1 grant-funded position during that time. So I would close and direct to the next person and say that think intentionally about the kind of experience that you need to collect as you make that transition so that you can make yourself more marketable.
Great. Kim?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this. And I'm going to echo very much similar the same sentiment. And that is, I think for me, a lot of the work when I started out and the building of that was very serendipitous for myself. And really to look at with intention, again, how you can build out from a base as a foundation. And I really got that when I was in undergraduate. So all the jobs that I ever had were in libraries and in museums. And so I kind of built out from there. And so a lot of the basis for, say, a staff position at a university came from my student jobs. And I really tried to pick up sort of a flurry of different kinds of responsibilities by volunteering, but also asking some of the management, hey, can I learn perhaps authorities, something like that, very specific things. When I started in the 90s, it was, I worked in a slide collection. So a lot of the technology has changed. And so that's been interesting for me to have to pick up since probably 95, a lot of the changes of technologies. And so that's been really interesting. But what it allowed me to do was really kind of hone in, and we're going to get to this question later about what has driven me to realize that I am a materials person. I really thrive on the materiality of print. And so those experiences really helped me shape to hone in on what I really wanted to do. And when we get into the question later about maybe what made me change, and I can talk about that too, I had to reflect back on those experiences. So essentially like a building block from a student up, and you start to sort of pick and choose from your undergraduate experience and sort of eliminate a lot of those jobs on your resume, but you still bring with you a lot what you learned as a student.
A question came up in the Q&A, which I'm just going to pop in for a moment because our next panelist, or next to last, I should say, Amy noted a response to the question, which was, if you're not in a position where you can afford to get experience, what do you advise? I'm going to put a pin in that for the moment and let Lydia continue on in the conversation, and then we'll get back to Amy's response, and maybe everyone else can weigh in on that question too. Continue.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be included on this panel. So for my personal path, getting into archives and then going beyond, I had a lot of library work experience or volunteer experience from when I was in high school going through my undergraduate degree. But I actually was a very serious orchestral musician for my undergraduate, master's, and doctorate. And so I didn't really allow myself to look at to pursue other interests at the time. And so it was only after I realized that I could not beat some stage fright in a very serious way that I had to really take stock and kind of start it over again. And I had to fall back on some themes that I'd always grown up with, about the love of books, the love of history, of knowledge, and of preserving stories. And I kind of wandered into archives a little bit by accident. I kind of fell into it at the time, and I really embraced that role. And then throughout my master's degree in library science, I was able to get a lot of experience in that area through my graduate assistantships or other opportunities. And I wanted to add for the question here, if you're not in a position where you can afford to volunteer / intern to get experience, to just build on what Amy wrote about just keeping a pulse on on the profession, whether it is utilizing bridge or student rates or some other types of ways to engage with your professional organizations. Also seeing what's happening on social media and Twitter. And especially to make a plug for the mentoring programs for, say, RBMS or the Society of American Archivists. If you're able to get connected with those mentoring programs, then you can work very closely with somebody who's willing to help.
Okay, thanks, Lydia. Amy, why don't you take it from here?
Sure. So the question I find really interesting because in my background, I've done both. I've moved, I wouldn't say totally different, but my background is I have the PhD in English. So I moved from academia into libraries, archives, and then I moved out again. And both were very unique experiences. I think to answer the first question, how do I move? I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with how different your previous field was. One of the things that I really had to learn was the norms that existed in one field don't necessarily translate into the other, even if intellectually they're quite similar and they value the same things. But what are the working norms? Like, what do people consider, you know, a normal work day? What do they consider, you know, a highly productive person? What do they value? Who are the people that are respected in your field and why are they respected? And those kind of behavioral differences and intellectual differences and you know, just all those kinds of things that make up a work culture, the kind of soft skills can be very different depending on where you're situated. So that's something that I personally wish I had known to pay closer attention to. Because sometimes you don't realize how much you've been socialized into one way of thinking until you hopscotch into another. And then I do really think, though, that orienting yourself intellectually in a new field is very important. So making sure you know who are the critical voices, who's been the leaders in the past couple of years, what are the major debates, you know, what are things that are the hot topics, and that can do a lot to make sure that you are kind of at the cutting edge and you can prove yourself. And then for me to move out of special collections and librarianship in general, it was a pretty major switch. So I joke that I went from a library to a place with big biohazard stickers everywhere. Everything that is where I work put someone in the hospital. So I'm surrounded by infections that are globally sourced to be nasty. So it's kind of different. I think the main thing, though, is like you just have to be really comfortable being the odd one out. I always kind of felt a little odd because my background was different in libraries, and now I'm extremely odd because I'm the only person who's not a scientist other than like the accountant. And so I'm just frankly like a totally different species. Like I have very little in common, but at the same time, that's been really freeing and enjoyable. So if you're moving out, you just have to be prepared to be different and to be comfortable in that difference. So that's what I would have to say.
Thanks, Amy. There was a comment from one of our attendees who adds maybe there's some middle ground in low commitment volunteering, maybe even an hour or two per week, or helping a library online while also learning. And we do welcome your comments and suggestions. Yeah, one thing that I picked up on that all of you kind of shared with us is there are themes here, right? And one of them seems to be getting to know yourself. And then also the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is this idea of transferable skills. Before I move on to that, is there anything that any of the panelists would like to add about moving between special collections and the so-called adjacent professions that you know of?
I would just say, I know I
King.
myself have sometimes been resistant to types of retraining just because it can be expensive and time consuming for those of us already, you know, advanced in our careers, but sometimes you can do it for slightly cheaper. So for example, my company is paying for me to get certified in project management, and they paid for me to take an editing course. So sometimes you can get your company to sponsor that, or even if you have to pay for yourself, it's worth it because it's not, while it may be pricey, it's not the same as like a full master's degree. So looking at things like that, there's a lot of opportunities to skill up.
Kim, did you want to add to that?
Just real quick, I really want to emphasize to take real stock in activism work. If you work with community members and the sort of accomplice work or allyship work that you're doing has really great value in any of these professions. So never discount the time that you spend in the community coordinating, collaborating with people.
I'd second that. Okay, we'll go on to our next question. Question number 2. In your opinion, what kinds of jobs are outside of academia or the cultural heritage sector where librarians might be a good fit? What skills are common with those jobs, or what do I need to be aware of when applying for library jobs as, say, a rare bookseller, or applying for non-library jobs as a librarian or archivist? For this, we'll start with Kim, and then Lydia and Amy, and end with Shanae. And I mentioned something about transferable skills that might pop up here or there, but I'll let Kim start off.
Well, I'm going to really focus on the bookseller end of this because, as I say, it's sort of a alchemical marriage that I have between working in the antiquarian book trade and as a rare book librarian. There are, well, let me kind of back up a minute. I kind of fell into working in the antiquarian trade through professional development, really. And a lot of times it happens accidentally that you end up working in the trade, whether you volunteer your time, say at a book fair, and you just get to know people, or you get to know people through various professional development conferences where there happens to be a bookseller showcase. So because I have this subject specialty and a love for the materiality of books, it sort of almost seemed like a natural fit. One thing I do want to say, though, about the book trade and something to be aware of, if that is something that you are interested in, that is, while the professional organizations have ethics and responsibilities, when you move from academia, there are a different set of checks and balances that happen in academia that may not appear in the book trade. And so at times you may feel like, wow, like I can't believe I'm witnessing this kind of behavior, or I can't believe that I maybe have to do to do this, to engage in something that maybe in an academic setting that you wouldn't necessarily have to do. So one thing to remember is that with antiquarian the book trade, you are in a sales position. And so there's an aspect of that a lot of people are uncomfortable with, but it is a part of the trade because there's a sense of capital there. At the same time, you really can transfer a subject specialty. You can transfer those public service relationships that you develop with communications with people. And that's huge in the book trade. If you work the floor at a show, or you are constantly communicating with people, you develop a nuance, and those nuances sometimes appear when you deal with your researchers or you deal with the public, and you develop a kind of personality that works warmly with people. So I would say that's a huge similarity there as far as reference and the kind of skills you might need to work with the public and or donors. I mean, you develop relationships with donors working in archives and special collections, and those skills certainly transfer over definitely to the book trade. I would just say that sometimes there is a little bit of hand-holding that you have to do in the book trade as well. And that might appear in, say, working with donors and with certain researchers that have difficult situations, and sometimes explaining policies and procedures. That transfers over, I would say, in my experiences, but you work long hours. I mean, similarly in certain tenure track jobs, but in the book trade, there's a level of expectation that is quite different. And I can go into more specifics about that later, but I just kind of want to bring up a couple of those points about my experience of working in both. Sometimes you have to sort of bounce back and realize there are different institutional policies and procedures that sometimes don't actually appear working in the antiquarian trade.
Lydia?
Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about my current line of work. I started my job here as an outreach and engagement coordinator with Lyricists in March. And so it's a kind of a non-traditional but an archives adjacent role. So I interface a lot with archivists and special collections folks and also digital preservation people as I work with them to find the best hosted solutions for digital preservation and archive space. And in terms of transferable skills, I would say that I think what stood out in my resume, which seemed to gain more traction during the interview process, was actually my professional service record. And so that was my work with Archive Space as the open source program itself, which the organizational home is Lyricists, and other types of professional service organization in terms of being able to plan, to engage stakeholders, to execute projects, to have attention to detail, to be able to juggle multiple projects at one time. And so that's what I felt like the interview committee really looked at with my particular situation. And so that's what I would say also for anyone else is to really don't discount yourself with whatever types of professional engagement you do, because those especially can be ways that there's a lot of transferable skills that can carry forward.
Great. Before we go on, I just want to acknowledge there was a comment in the chat. Rebecca Patillo says it's nice to hear that service work paid off for you, Lydia. I always worry I'm overextending myself on service without much reward. Again, we can come back to this, but for the moment, we're going to transfer to Amy. I certainly can go on about service and the free time that you expend on doing those things. I'm sure we all can. Go ahead, Amy.
Sure. So the question was, what kind of jobs are outside of academia or the cultural heritage sector where it could be a good fit? I would say, although I don't have experience in this myself, UX type jobs. I know several of my friends that have library training went on to UX jobs. And I think it's particularly good for people with librarianship backgrounds because it requires you to be meticulous but other focused. You're trying to be empathetic and imagine often accessibility issues. You're conducting interviews with a lot of folks to sort of understand how do they interface with that particular software or website or what have you. And so I think that just the mindset that librarians often have and bring to the table can be good in UX, although it can require learning some more technology. And then I work as an editor and a project manager, and I think those are also good options. But just like UX, you have to have some additional skills. Editing, I thought it might be especially challenging to jump into the biological and medical sciences because that's something I had absolutely no background in. I found that less difficult, other than like the first few months where I just like wrote down every word I didn't know and looked it up. And those lists were very long. But you know, sentences are sentences. So if you have a really strong writing and editing background from graduate school, that might be a good place for you to go, but you'd have to be very familiar with kind of that echelon of work, which some people are and some people aren't. And then project management can be very good if you're highly organized and already kind of perform that function often within your current workplace or just your life. So I always kind of joked as one of the most organized people that I knew. Like I'm a super minimalist, and that really helped. But project management still proved very challenging to me. I found project management more difficult than editing medical content, and I thought it would be the opposite. So I think that those are three fields that can be really good for folks with our background, but that doesn't mean it's like necessarily like an immediate translation. It's more like you might have the right type of brain to do this type of work, but we all could use some more skills, because I know I certainly did.
Shanae.
I'm glad I'm going last because I have the privilege of braiding some of these threads for my fellow panelists. I think the same communication skills that are involved with providing some of the specialized research assistance to users that we do in our reading rooms are the same kind of skills that are required to build relationships in a number of comparable fields. As far as transferable skills, I found that my academic background and professional experiences, especially being able to speak that shared language and be real aware of the issues and the problems that librarians are trying to solve in the digital space, was what made, what influenced the hiring committee to hire me at Dpla. I would recommend being strategic about identifying your transferable skills, like not looking for the obvious thing and being creative. When I was on the search for a non-traditional archives jobs, I started to look at tech companies, especially education technology companies. And I started to look at some of the job titles, like what Amy said: research analyst, community manager, researcher, program manager, program specialist, subject matter expert is a really popular one. And then depending on the company, some of the roles were like solutions architect, project coordinator. And I would recommend like look at the roles with library vendors, those library vendors who, have been vetted and that we don't have problematic relationships with, service providers, and tech companies who are doing usability training and customer relations. We do a lot of that work in the reading room and on our university and college committees, where we're doing customer relations with university and faculty, and we're doing outreach with K through 12 educators as part of our outreach programs. And some of those ed tech companies are building with those users in mind. I would also recommend checking out funding organizations like foundations and nonprofits with community impact funds, because they usually re-grant money to local cultural heritage organizations, and having someone in the room who can speak to that world is only an advantage to them. I also have a website for tech jobs that I discovered during the pandemic, and I will add that in chat.
Super, yeah, thanks, Shanae. One of our attendees noted that she's frantically writing down all of the titles that you mentioned, but we do have the recording. Does anyone want to add to that? I think that for me, I had similar experiences, and I noticed that a lot of heads were nodding from the panel as Shanae was going over the kind of creative thinking that you have to do. It's not speaking from my perspective, just to inject this for a moment, but it's not about reinventing your own prior experience and shifting your title in your resume to match what you're going for at a certain company. It's because you want to be honest about who you are and what your skills are, but it's also an opportunity for you to rethink those skills that you have and see if they apply to these other places. And Shawnee just added that job list in the chat, which is great for ed tech, tech, and special collection-ish jobs by title, location, and industry. We're going to move on to question number 3. Okay. And now the serious turn. No. How did you know it was time to move on to something else? Or when did you know it was time to move on to something else? How did you start planning for that outcome? Did you encounter any barriers? What about continuing education? We'll start with Lydia, then Amy, then Shawnee, then Kim.
Well, I'd say that like this is something very personal for everybody. So it could be for many different reasons, whether it's that you feel like somehow you've outgrown your position, that maybe you start to feel like you've got more to offer than only, whatever your current job duties have, and that that maybe there's not necessarily a clear growth path for your present position. And or maybe it's many other things, maybe it's external factors too, but I think for me and maybe for some other people, there's a kind of a grieving process that happens, when you come to a realization that this is not the place that you will finish your career in, but there's also a lot of possibilities, and it's also kind of a staggering amount of possibilities. And so I think just beginning to apply for other types of positions to see what type of responses you can get, like trying on different hats, is kind of a way to feel your way forward. If you know that where you currently are is not necessarily where you want to or that you can stay. And so in terms of the path forward, I basically had to take stock again and just kind of go, well, what really do I care about? What really do I enjoy doing? And so in my particular case, I really did enjoy larger profession-wide impact kind of work. So collaborating across institutions. I really liked interfacing with a lot of different people to collectively build ideas together. And so that was kind of my guiding star. And it was kind of funny because I was speaking with a mentor one time, and for my particular situation, I knew that I needed to find a remote job because my partner, I'm geographically bound, basically. I was not able to find a way to feasibly move the entire family away. And so I kind of half jokingly said, I really wish that I could get a job with Lyrasis. And it just, 2 months later, I sent a text and said, well, I guess it's happening. So in terms of any barriers, I'd say that I feel very fortunate because I was in a position to slowly start reaching out feelers and see what I could get, basically, while I was currently employed. And so that was, I know that that's a luxury that many people don't have. So I'd say that wherever you are, I hope that try to learn as much as possible by pursuing continuing education and also pursuing the leads of, say, if you're doing professional service opportunities, and ask around and see if other people have some leads that can open some doors. In terms of continuing education, in my particular case, I didn't really need to do any additional continuing education. I think being a practicing archivist was attractive, and having the credentials I had was attractive, which I know is also a privilege that I had. I'd say that also, in addition to professional organizations like RBMS and SAA, to also look at other types of continuing education training, whether that's like more basic job skill types of training, such as conflict resolution, or like navigating difficult conversations, or other things like that. Any other types of broader skill bases can help.
Yeah, I love that you added that about different kinds of continuing education, Lydia, because I think that oftentimes, especially in the RBMS like orbit, we end up just hearing about the same kinds of classes over and over again from the same institutions, Cal RBS, Rare Book School, go to these things, right? And there is much more that we can learn about a lot, and using those. It's great that you brought that up about how to express yourself better and how to address different questions and stuff like that, like this. Amy, you just put a recommendation in the chat, so you're next.
So the book is Exit, Voice, Loyalty, and the title of the book really does all the work for you, but if you want to read more, you can actually read the book. And that basically means, like, sociologically, you only have 3 options for really anything, and that is you leave, you complain, or you stay and presumably shut up. And if one doesn't work for you, you need to try another. And you can go through a mourning process, and in fact, I think that you should expect that. But at the same time, change is inevitable in life, and I think too, I take some comfort in evolution, that what survives are the things that are able to cope with change. And so I don't necessarily envy people that have been in the same career or the same job for a long time. I think there's some real power to that, and there's a lot of knowledge that gets built up, and sometimes, you know, I feel like, oh, it must be so nice to have that sort of security. But at the same time, I know that my strength as a professional is my ability to shape shift, and that will bode well for me. And who knows, you know, like, I really never thought that I would be spending a lot of time on antifungals. Like, that pretty much just never occurred to me. But you know what, it works out great. And I work with really smart people. And it's been a lovely transition for the most part. So I think there's a lot you can say about the individual circumstances that each of us faces, but ultimately you need to choose if it's time to voice, and if voice isn't working, if you're going to be loyal or you're going to step out. And then in terms of did you encounter any barriers? I personally didn't, other than just, you know, coming to the realization that it was time. And then, yes, I had to do some additional continuing education, not right when I started, but later down the line, to skill up. So I think the major barrier is your own self, and also any ego you have. I really had to get real humble. That helped.
Flexibility about oneself and other things. Who's next? Shanae, you're next.
How I knew it was time to leave my former position was that really I peaked too fast, and we don't talk about that often professionally. We, you know, sign up for all of the things, we put in our if we have tenure, we you know, we select opportunities based on doing that, and I went too hard too fast. I was awarded, I'm not humble bragging either, I was awarded Faculty Member of the Year right before a leadership transition. And I saw declining student enrollment, new leadership, and a new strategic focus that wasn't clear to me. Like all of those started to feel like writing on the wall, and I wanted to look for remote positions within the GLAM or ed tech sectors to have a change of pace, really. And I wanted to work collaboratively within library archives and special collections with DPLA in a different kind of setting. And I also hadn't reflected on it until, you know, that this conversation came about. But I also was having some quality of life issues. DPLA is a fully remote company. It's been fully remote. So I was looking forward to having that flexibility, but there was a huge emotional reprieve in not having to go to a reading room every day. I experienced many microaggressions in that space. And there was dissonance for me because I found it a really life-giving place where I could support students of color and their public history programs and be a mentor to undergraduate history students. But in that same space, I was also being called girl by alumni, and I was subject to staff persons sharing their university reflections using racial slurs. So it wasn't until I was removed from that space that I realized how cathartic and safe I felt in a remote position. Additionally, like when it comes to professional development and skills gaps, I think that, you know, our profession kind of does us a disservice, and that many of us are loner rangers or can be a part of small staffs where everyone is a master of everything. And we're used to doing so many things. However, in other fields, and what I found at DPLA is that I'm encouraged to lead from my strengths because there are other people who are doing the specialized work that I'm not good at. I'm not the tech person. I'm the people person. So I'm able to do that. And I've found that being in the director of community engagement position, which is really outward facing, that I had a skills gap in public speaking. So I sought professional development opportunities once I got into my new position that were relevant to the work that I was doing before. So for me, it was, I didn't know what I was missing until I tried something different, and, you know, graciously had the support from my new leadership to support me in growing in that gap.
Great. Kim?
Okay, so I'm gonna kind of be punk rock for a minute. I knew it was time to move on when my position contract came to an end. It was sort of like, yeah, you're done here. And so there was no availability for any recurring time. At the same time, I was very angry about the structure of the bureaucracy. And so for me, it didn't feel like these types of positions really meshed with my my political beliefs and my sort of aggression that I was having it at the time in activism. And so I had to really sort of step back and look and reassess and go, look, are you working against the system? Or are you going to work within the system or whatnot? How can you take those skills and sort of apply them so that they're adaptive, but they're also intersectional and or that are valuable for people, and not just think about like, well, you know, what am I going up against here? And so it kind of worked out for me, again, serendipitously. And I also feel like I had the privilege to do that. I'm reflecting back in order to be able to sort of work fluidly within my background in special collections, but kind of really identify what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do that. And so, you know, really it was, I didn't have a plan necessarily, but I knew at that time, as I said before, that I really wanted to hone in on working directly with materials because I hadn't felt like I had been doing that enough to where it was engaging. And so the barriers really that I encountered come from a personal situation that I think we're going to address in the next question. but to me, to continue that, I continued my education comes working with the activism that I do, and sort of my independent outreach capabilities through zines, through doing direct action, for doing those types of things that stem from my own personal hobbies or outreach. And so I think there's something to be said there for really looking at things that you do that you enjoy in your life that you can develop out to. You can, go into this as a scholar, as a punk scholar, taking those ideas and really applying them to your career path.
Yeah, the value of your side interests. Great. So yeah, as Kim alluded, our final question does reveal a little bit more perhaps about all of our panelists. Do you have any suggestions for handling the personal side of changing careers, parentheses, kids and parental care, partner careers, circles of friends, etc.? We'll start with Amy on this one, then Shanae, then Kim, and then Lydia.
Eesh. Okay, I was settling back to listen to other people.
Happy to talk about my readjustment to life in the rural Midwest due to unexpected family circumstances, if that helps.
Yeah. I will say for the personal side of changing careers, I mean, to be honest, in some ways I got it easy because I moved from living in North Liberty, a small town, and commuting to Iowa City, which is 20 minutes away, to living in North Liberty and having a job literally 1 mile away. So and then immediately COVID happened and I never left my house. So in terms of kid, I do have a kid, I do have a husband. My husband was unemployed for a significant amount of time, and that added some stress in terms of supporting him in the ways that he needed to. It meant that my career was very important because we were supporting a child as well as each other. But mainly, I think that the biggest suggestions are that I have is that maintain your friendships and your relationships with the people from your prior career, because one, you never know what will happen. You may change and go back to where you were doing something slightly different. But I mean, outside of that, really functional thing, you just really, hopefully there's some people that you really care about. And some of my most important relationships in my life are people that I've met through school and work. And I want to be close to them, whether or not we do the same job at all, or, something even related to one another. So I guess hold tight to the people that have been close to you, and then take it as a great opportunity to let go of others, and that it's a moment for you to sort of reevaluate what's significant to you and what maybe has passed its time. Don't burn bridges, but you can gently hold on or gently let go. And then also, understanding what your locational preferences are and realizing that that you can't always get what you want, but you can often get a lot more than you think if you're willing to go outside the box. And you can also be made happy by a lot of things you would not have expected. Things that I thought were really critical to me turned out not to be so. So just, keep an open mind, because we all change as individuals. Who we are when we're 20 is not the same as 30 or 40, so it's hard to be prescriptive about what's going to work best for you at any given moment in your life, because you might have obligations from your family or community that you didn't when you were younger, or you might have more freedom. And, I always tell people when I did talks at universities, to both check your privilege, but also lean into your particular privilege. So if you have the opportunity to work nearby, go for it. If you have the opportunity to work remotely, go for it. But know what's important to you and move on from there. Maybe that's not the most succinct answer, but that's where I am right now.
That was great, Amy. I'm just going to make one quick time check. We are at 4 minutes to the hour, so this is our last question. This is a very appreciated session from all of our attendees so far and in the comments. And I'm going to let Shanae take it over.
Thank you. I'll be brief. When I started at Dpla, it was right before the pandemic kicked off, and we had considerable travel requirements where we were going to visit public libraries and attending conferences. And I found myself as a person who was working remotely, but also flying out of the Delta hub, I'm based in Atlanta, weekly, that I needed to create new routines and new rituals to incorporate my family in the change of my life. And that looked like having my grandfather drive me to the airport. It looked like being intentional about peer mentorship and using, the tech tools that we're all now familiar with to schedule one-on-ones. In addition to the professional committee work that I was doing, I was really taking the time to still maintain some connections with peers and former colleagues. And that's it. I would just say being intentional about keeping the things that are important to you in the next phase of your career with you as you go through it. I was talking to a colleague last week who shared, we were talking about what are you doing for self-care during this time? And they shared with me, that they were spending a lot of time with family, and they were concerned that when we return to whatever our lives at this moment, that they'll lose that. And I said, you don't have to lose that. You have an awareness right now that that's a priority. So make it a priority on the other side of whatever this is.
Awesome. Yeah.
Okay, so for me, I can definitely speak to this, and I want to say 100% of what everyone's saying, and Amy for sure, like keeping those relationships with past. I wouldn't have had my current job had I not had those relationships. But in 2017, my mother suffered a really serious illness and injury, and I had to basically disrupt my whole life because I was the only, and still am, pretty much the only caregiver for my mom. And this is at a distance. So travel with not only that, but also the book trade is essential for me, and it still is. And so when the pandemic happened, that really put a huge just issues for everything in my entire life. Luckily, I was able to adapt and do things during this time that I could do through digital services to be able to do everything and video and things like that, as most of us have. But one of the things that I realized is that I really needed to identify what mattered to me and what was important to me. And what came up really high on the list was the fact that I would need to be a caregiver for my mother. And so piecing together these jobs that allowed me the flexibility to be able to travel, to be able to take the time off, that I work with a gracious staff here that allows me to do that flexibility, that's important to me. And so for those of you that have pieced together jobs, maybe you work part-time here, maybe work part-time there, don't give up hope. And then if you want something more full-time or something that allows you more structure, and that's your ultimate goal, it's like, don't give up hope on these sort of side jobs or gig jobs that you're piecing together. Like, you will get there. I have purposely chosen to do these sort of gig jobs because that allows me that freedom and that liberty and the privilege to be able to go travel. But I would say that there's something to be said about living sort of monastically, in terms of, I've chosen not to have on purpose a tenure track at this point in my life, or a job that maybe financially pays better because of my responsibilities for my family. Do I have a problem with folks that go for the salary? Absolutely not. I'm not that much of an anarchist that I say, no, you can't have, wealth in your life, fortune through your career. I think though that being able to have that privilege though, at this point in my life as a middle-aged person, is where I need to be at this moment. And there's no shame in choosing that for yourself.
Lydia, let you take it away and be our last word. We have gone a trifle over time, but I thank you all for staying with us. Go ahead, Lydia.
Okay, I feel the pressure. But I'd say that in my particular case, that as other panelists have said, in choosing the path forward, I did have an internal matrix about what are the things that are absolute priorities, what are some things that are some realities that are not going to change that I have to operate within. And so it was very much influenced by, in my particular case, my spouse's geographic limitation, and it also has become even more of a something that I value, working full-time remotely with lyricists, to have a degree of flexibility with my lifestyle and with and so in that way it can be about self-care in terms of I never really was able to eat breakfast before, you know, like that's something I can do. I was never I was in places where I didn't have a window, and once I started in this new position, I realized that there were some things that I hadn't noticed before that actually kind of connected me and woke me up a little bit more to things that I hadn't realized that I missed earlier. And I also appreciated being able to have this flexibility to be present with my children now. So again, those are some things that I'm grateful for, and those are some factors that I deeply considered when making career changes.
Great, that was a lovely conclusion there, Lydia. Thank you. No worries about being overtime or on a pressure situation. My last slide is up now. Thank you all for joining us. Lydia, thanks for having the last word. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but all of the panelists have put their email addresses in the chat. Join me in a virtual round of applause for our panelists. Thank you, Amy, Shanae, Kim, and Lydia. And especially we'd like to thank ACRL, Elois Sharp, and Erica Jens, and Beth DeBold, as well as the planning group for pulling this and the additional RBMS jobs and hiring webinars together. Thank you to everyone listening to this live or on the recording for your time today. We hope to see you at the next and final session in the Jobs and Hiring series next week. Have a fantastic day, everyone. We can stop our recording.